right now. So
Oh,
we
is
might
that?
not, yeah. Yeah. So we'll see, how much, said at a certain point she'll be able to come back in and join us on it. But for right now, I'm going to go and, okay, and get started on this. All right. All right. Welcome everyone today to CleanStart for our CleanStart perspective. I'm Thomas Hall, Executive Director of CleanStart, and today we're going to be talking with John Fanzino, of the CEO of GridSME. That's Grid Subject Matter Experts. So they really focus on pretty much anything that touches the grid. They work with a lot of groups like Cal ISO and SMUD on understanding the grid and services. Now, if you are curious about how you can grow your company, CleanStart works with CSU Sacramento to provide acceleration services through the Carlson Center and the College of Engineering and Computer Science. If you want to get in touch with those resources, reach out to us or reach out to them directly. CleanStart's perspectives are sponsored by SMUD, Sac State, Moss Adams, Weintraub Tobin, and Blue Tech Valley. And they're also supported by attendees on this. So we're going to drop a link to our PayPal in here. If you want to buy us a cup of coffee, we would really appreciate it. It helps us keep these going. We've now done over 50 of these short perspectives slash to do and over 65 virtual events in the past year. So we've kept on going. Now, some quick announcements before we get into this. We have some upcoming Clean Start events. On the 29th, we have Community Energy, which I'm really excited about because we have Block Power, which is bringing private finance to community improvement. So if you look up Block Power, you'll see that they got $68 million of investment, and they got backing by BlackRock Financial. So they're bringing private market financing to consumer products in there. Additionally, on May 6th, we have Moneta VC. And on May 13th, not at the regular 9 o'clock time, we're going to have Paul Lau from apparently Smug. I need to look at that closer, but it's Paul Lau from SMUD, and they have their zero carbon by 2030 plan. Also, if you're a startup, check out the Venture Catalyst events from the Wet Center today and later this week so that you can figure out how to protect your IP and raise that first round of capital. So on Friday, check out the Wet Center and what they're doing down there at Fresno State. Other big exciting news, the Business Journal just kind of profiled us and asked a lot of questions about the big clean tech boom that's happening in Sacramento. Check that out, along with at noon today, our associate, Soraya Jackson, is getting interviewed on Sac State's Instagram. So go check that out. I'm sure she's going to do a great job, and we're really excited for it. And with that, we're going to start moving into the event today. So I would like to welcome John, the CEO of GridSME. He brings a mix of technical and business skills to the table, along with unrelenting drive to challenge the status quo, improve business operations, and explore new opportunities with a fresh perspective. We've had John on before on our different grid talks, and one of the things that he touched on that we wanted to really explore today was security. It's something that's incredibly important to SMUD and pretty much all utilities, California ISO, and if you're looking to get an RFP from any of them, you got to have all your ducks in a row. So we're going to learn more about that for now from John. So welcome, John.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. Let me share my screen here. 1 second. So yeah, as Tom mentioned, cybersecurity, obviously, really any industry is a hot topic right now, but particularly the electric industry. And within that, we're going to specifically talk about cybersecurity supply chain risk management. Okay. So everyone should see my screen here. Sharing mode. Is my little video thing blocking some of the screen?
Nope, it looks great.
That looks good. Okay, perfect. All right, so we're gonna spend some time just first explaining and making sure we all are coming from the same, working from the same, talking about cyber supply. We're going to talk about some real life events and how that's translated into some recent regulations that have been imposed on utilities, as well as a lot of the changing regulations and kind of unknown landscape that's out there right now with some of the executive orders and other things going on within the government and FERC reliability space. And then from that, we'll start looking at, and hopefully spend the most time talking about it as a, a startup and a potential vendor to these types of utilities and organizations, what you should be thinking about and doing to be best prepared for that first questionnaire or that first request you're going to get from a potential utility. So when we talk about supply chain, most people always think about materials and components and the physical aspect that goes into assembly on a factory floor, and that is supply chain, obviously. And to that regard, kind of have this interesting mix of physical and cyber supply chain issue right now with what's happening with silicon chips. There is a supply shortage that's impacting silicon chips because of partly COVID, partly because we are very, very heavily reliant on China for some of the rare earth metals that go into those chips. And as a result, right now, many manufacturers in the U.S., particularly the car manufacturers, having to slow down production and causing a lot of issues. So when we're talking supply chain, it's really everything. But when we're talking cyber supply chain, it's more about the software or the hardware component, but also about trusted vendor relationships. That's what people don't think about when they talk about supply chain, is that we also, now that we have interconnected networks, when we're business partners, we exchange emails and we have other ways to communicate and ties from a cyber perspective, this idea of a trusted vendor relationship is actually one of the biggest risks for cyber supply chain. And what happens typically is the bad actors, especially nation states, they know that large organizations and utilities being one of them, have bigger budgets. They have, usually in theory and hopefully more mature cybersecurity postures. So rather than try to break in their front door, a lot of the time what happens is they'll go to a smaller supplier who doesn't have that same cybersecurity budget or strong posture. They'll compromise their email, usually phishing. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And then they use that trusted business relationship to be able to gain access into the larger utility, for example. So I just wanted to make sure that when we're talking supply chain today, we are talking the hardware and the software component, as people think about when we say supply chain. But we're also talking about trusted business relationships, because those are being heavily exploited. And that's a lot of time we see, companies that I work with get questionnaires about all these cybersecurity questions. They're like, well, we're just providing services. We're just an engineering shop. We're not delivering a product. Why does any of this apply? And they're right to some extent. Not everything applies. Some things are specific to more of the manufacturing product development. But a lot of things do apply, even just because you have that trust. So I just want to go over a few real life examples. We don't have time to go over all of these, but I'll start with the most recent, probably the most well known at this point, which is the recent SolarWinds. So that came to light in late 2020, but this actually started back in 2019. What happened is SolarWinds is a software vendor, provides IT, network monitoring, and security software. Many large government organizations, large utilities, very large corporations use SolarWinds software. Maybe I should say used SolarWinds software. What happened was they have, as part of their software and their service, they deliver updates to their software packages. They do that through a software update servers. That server, one of their servers, compromised. What happened is bad actors were able to enter malware, what looked like a legitimate SolarWinds software update that lived and was hosted on SolarWinds' actual software update server. So over 18,000 SolarWinds customers thought they were going to pull down the latest and greatest SolarWinds update. Usually security fixes are in there too. And what they happened to pull down was part real SolarWinds software and also a little extra goodie. And so that's how they spread out and got a foothold in so many organizations because of that central software update server that SolarWinds, their supply chain, right? So that's one example of a company who supplied, they were victims. SolarWinds was you can argue they should have done a lot better security, but that's not here or there, the point of this discussion. Another example would be Asus. They sell laptops, other hardware. They have update services for those laptops. Their update servers were compromised, pushed out malware to the laptop. So those are two examples of where a company was a victim to a supply chain attack. They didn't knowingly or willingly do anything bad or implant malware with the supply chain. They fell victim to the attack and were the vehicle to for the bad actors to get them. There's another class of examples with Kaspersky and DJI and Huawei. And those are supply chain events, not because they were compromised, so to speak, but because there has been indication and findings that those companies, which are headquartered in foreign adversarial countries, Russia and China, respectively, that and have ties to the government there because that's just how it goes, that they were planting backdoors and other ways to eavesdrop and spy on users of those products. So, for example, in 2017, when that was found out, research, Kaspersky was banned from being used within any utility environment and other governmental organizations. Same thing happened with DJI shortly after, where they found indications that they were, headquarters in China would be able to stream all live video and other metadata from drone flight. So those drones got banned from use. They recently came out with a government-approved one, but there's still research going on in that. And same thing with Huawei and 5G and telecom. There's that risk. So there's that foreign adversarial risk with those three examples, and there's just risk of knowingly falling victim to a itself. Then we'll jump into some of the regulations that have resulted from some of these real life. Obviously, solar winds, there's a lot of it happening right now. Expect some more knee-jerk reaction regulations, but that hasn't come to light yet. But CIP 13, so CIP stands for Critical Infrastructure. That is the group of regulations and requirements, both physical and cybersecurity related, that registered entities that either generate, transmit, sell, buy, whatever power on the multi need to comply with. And so all of the utilities, SMUD, PG&E, et cetera, they all have to comply with CIP 13 as of July 2020. And also, just so everyone is aware, there is already movement and changes going on so that these supply chain risk management requirements don't just apply to the larger, a subset of these, also the larger organizations, medium or high impact entities. But now they're already working on revision to push out similar requirements down to the low impact level. And that is where you start to rope in a lot of these distributed energy resources, solar, wind, energy storage systems, generators. So there's more changes coming there. We're going to dive into what CIP 13 is and how you guys can start to think about helping utilities comply with that. Then we already mentioned the executive order. So back in May of last year, Trump released an executive order that basically said, we will not allow you to procure and utilize equipment on a bulk electric system that was either that was supplied by a company that's either headquartered or manufactures the component. An average, really with a main focus on China there. And then enter Biden, and in early January puts a hold on that executive order, and then in February puts out a new executive order that broadly I talked about provisions in there to address like talked about. So the moral of the EO story is that there is so much movement and changes happening there. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not going to sit here and speculate what comes or doesn't come of that. But it should just highlight the level of scrutiny that supply chain is from the top of the government right now. And then lastly, we're talking about investor insurance requirements. Because really, regardless of who you're selling to, if maybe you're selling to not directly to the utility, but somebody else, you're still going to have contractual requirements that are just getting imposed on the purchaser and their insurance and investors and passed through to you or directly to you if you need to procure insurance or anything like that for your own. So we'll unpack some of those risk assessment questionnaires so you guys can think about how to start addressing that proactively. So we're going to start by reverse engineering SIP 13. So all the SIP standards, if anyone needs to sleep at night, are available. You can go on the internet and read them. But it is, especially for this one, it's a good lens into understanding what does the utility need to do, which will inform you what are they going to turn around and ask you to do as a supplier, right? So if you read through all the legalese and language in there and kind of distill it down, it really comes out to 4 main areas that vendors and suppliers to utilities that need to comply with SIP 13 absolutely must think about. It starts with an incident response plan. So the utility has a requirement to set up some sort of process with their vendors to communicate and coordinate on potential incidents, right? And going back to the first point I made earlier on, don't just think about this as an incident on your, if you're a manufacturer of a hardware or software, and don't just think this as an incident to your product or your network or your factory for the manufacturer. This will also apply really to your entire corporate environment or right at any corporate assets because of that trusted vendor relationship risk I mentioned earlier. So utilities are going to want to see that these vendors and suppliers have a way to identify potential incidents, a way to contain and eradicate incidents, and have almost most importantly, have a way to coordinate and communicate those incidents with all parties that need to be made aware. And so in addition to that, you're also going to need to have a process around access management. The utilities have a requirement to make sure that they're controlling and restricting all access, vendor access included. So you have an obligation. Let's say, for example, Bob, he has a justified business reason to have access into the utilities environment. That's approved by the utility. That's all well and good. But maybe next week, Bob is terminated or Bob changes roles and he no longer has a business need to access the utilities environment. You guys as a vendor at the very, very minimum need to have a process in place to make sure you go ahead and proactively notify the utility or utilities that you have a relationship with to say, hey, Bob is changing roles or Bob is terminated. Please go revoke his actions. You no longer need that. And that's going to help the utility comply with all the requirements they have to help. The next 2 are a little more specific for vendors and suppliers that actually supply a product, hardware or software, of course. And that's having a vulnerability management program. So having a way to identify and track and remediate vulnerabilities within the scope of product that you have supplied to this utility. And that means, you need to be keeping up on so what happens with software, of course, is we're not all reinventing the wheel. So you're using packages from other pieces of software, open source packages, right? So you got to think about that entire, software development lifecycle and understand that, hey, when, the Open SSL package has a security vulnerability and a subsequent patch, that also feeds into your scope of product that you supplied the utility. So having a process to manage all of that, making sure the appropriate security vulnerabilities are being identified and addressed is super important. And then tying directly into that, of course, is patch management. So once we have identified a vulnerability, come up with a fix for a vulnerability, usually that fix is in the form of a security patch. And so having a process and a system in place so that you guys can manage those patches and distribute them securely to your utility or purchasers so that they can go and patch their systems accordingly. I say securely, of course, because as we talked about with SolarWinds and ASUS, that's a very real attack vector that bad actors can leverage is that in that software update process, which is one of the reasons why you can see in the second to last requirement there, the utility has an obligation to verify the integrity of all software patches prior to applying. So and if you guys are familiar with checksums, right? That's a typical way to verify the integrity of a software package. That's not always perfect though, because in the SolarWinds example, SolarWinds thought that was a legitimate package too, unfortunately. But just think about these different layers to put in place to manage that risk. On the executive order front, I won't beat this horse dead because it's really just ill-defined right now and there's a lot to shake out. But what you can start doing in the meantime is identifying and understanding, do you have your own suppliers that are coming from overseas? And are they coming from potentially foreign adversarial countries overseas? And again, is that supplier of yours headquartered or manufactured their products in either one of those? So start to think about that. And if you do identify you have those types of suppliers, potentially start thinking about alternate suppliers. Because again, we're now with Biden's EO, it's not just focused on the cybersecurity aspect, but we've kind of opened up supply chain more broadly. So you're gonna have to start thinking about it from, am I sourcing, rare earth metals from China, and there's a potential, 90% of them come from China. That's the supply chain. Cyber one per se. It's a physical material one, but just thinking about that holistically is going to be best to start addressing what may or may not come out of Biden. And then lastly, the good old vendor cybersecurity questionnaire. These come in so many different shapes and sizes, and it's really part of the root of the cybersecurity problem right now is that there's very limited cohesion across the board. You can go work with utility A and you're going to get requirements X, Y, Z said one way. And then you can go work with utility B and you're going to get requirements A, B, C said a different way. So the language is being used, how the requirements are being asked. There's not that much commonality or cohesion yet, unfortunately. So it makes this difficult and everything sort of kind of becomes one off. But with that said, there are some common frameworks that can be leveraged to develop a program and fundamental cybersecurity program that's going to address most of these questionnaires as they come along in their different shapes and sizes. So if you're a manufacturer of hardware or software, being certified in ISO 27001 or 27002 is a great starting place. It's one of the typical supplier contract questions that we're going to be asked. If you handle any sort of financial data, SOC Type 2 is most likely going to be applicable and asked of you. And these are good, easy ways to kind of stop the question verbatim, right? So what's going to happen is they're going to come out with a kind of standard list of questions and inquiries. You can come out the gate, say, yeah, I'm certified in ISO 27001 and I have a SOC 2 certification as well. You're going to do good at reducing the subsequent questions that are going to be asked compared to saying, no, I don't have any of those certifications, and no, I don't have an asset inventory management program. You can bet you're going to start getting asked more and more questions, really digging into what do you or don't you have. And in the end, that could impact definitely the timing of your contract process, have major implications. But it could also, if severe enough, could actually, put the kibosh on the purchase going through. I would say the most fundamental one everyone needs to be thinking about and should implement regardless of your company size, because it's a very low cost and a very high return on investment control to do, is security awareness. You can bet that in every one of these types of questionnaires or inquiries, one of the questions will be, do you have a security awareness? And I say everyone should be doing that regardless of whether or not you've had one of these questionnaires issued to you yet or not, because it is such a cheap control to implement and such a high return on investment. Going back to my initial point around phishing still being the most effective attack vector. Well, phishing emails are received by humans. So you can have all the fancy AI, machine learning, cybersecurity tools you want. At the end of the day, humans are always the weakest link in the security chain. And there's really nothing we can do about it in current times besides educate and train. So training your employees on basic security awareness measures, especially email security, goes such a long way. And again, it's going to be asked of you by the utilities. So might as well get ahead of that. So that's it at a high level. Want to make sure we have some time for questions, and yeah, hopefully that was helpful, and don't hesitate to dig in deeper.
I
Thanks
got,
very much, John.
I've got
Uh,
a
Go
question, if you
ahead.
don't mind, Gary. So you're talking about like, your beginning company, they need to start thinking about, I guess, educating and security awareness. Um, is there kind of what resources should a company go and consider or look at to get a better understanding of this? Because if a company's, they're focusing on their solution, a lot of times, things like this don't always, come up. But where can they get good, basically education or understanding of where they start on this? I mean, where should someone start? I guess that's the better question.
Yeah, so I can share some resources in the chat, but just to say them verbally, there's a ton of free security awareness resources out there. You have organizations like SANS that has both free and paid security awareness, where, yeah, to your point, Tom, nobody, especially, at the startup scale, should be spending time developing their own security awareness. It's a wheel that's already been built. But even though it's not your core business, cybersecurity, just that email security, putting out that awareness, that is applicable to every single business. I don't care what shape or size. So many examples of businesses sending 30 grand to a bad invoice that most people don't realize this is happening all day, every day. So there's SANS. There's a company called Wiser that does free security awareness. GridSME, we put out security awareness as part of our managed security service offering. Distribute that to free because we're developing that already for all of our customers. So we put that out as well. So you can see some awareness posts on LinkedIn. Our security awareness is a little more tailored for generators, control centers, the utility assets, but it still covers, basic things, security awareness topics. But those resources like SANS, Wiser, and I can think of a few more, provide some links. They have really good libraries of just general email security and, laptop security and things like that really any business owner should be aware of.
Yeah, that's excellent, because that I think it would be a great resource, because I'd also note that Moss Adams, one of our sponsors, they also have their internet security and knowledge on the grid too.
Yeah.
So there's a whole host of people out there that you can go in and check with, and it's great that there's a lot of free resources. I hope that you share them, because I feel like there would be a lot of resources that aren't so great that are free out there. Is there anything that, if you're going out there and looking at them, that you should stay away from?
No, I mean, I haven't really come across anything like that. I mean, there's definitely ones that are a little higher quality content-wise than others, of course. But I can't think of any off the top of the head that I would say stay away from that. That's worse than doing nothing. Any of those resources are going to be better than doing nothing.
Okay.
Well, let me ask a question, John, on the matter of defining who's a responsible entity, and would be subject to some of these regulations. We have a number of companies, and there are many emerging across the country that do sell grid interactive devices now, but they're intended to be storage systems on home solar that interact with pricing information.
Yep.
Or, in some other way to make a virtual storage system or virtual power plant, and other things that are being done on microgrid controls. Is there some cutoff as to size of a responsible entity, or where they are positioned on the grid, behind the meter, in front of the meter, that would need to pay attention to the new regulations and the executive orders that you've discussed?
Yeah, so we got to separate the two. The executive order, again, it's still sausage making in the process, but that is much more broadly applicable. That does not fall under the FERC NERC construct, so it's not constrained within that jurisdiction. I'll talk about that in a second. So that really applies to everyone that's supplying components to the grid. The way that Trump's executive order defined it was anything that was being used to supply power above 69 kV, which is the typical cutoff threshold between the distribution system and the transmission system voltages. And that kind of, so it's a little more broad because you have these owners of what's unregistered NERC assets that have to comply with the EO. For SIP 13 and what a responsible entity is, it's a pretty narrow focus, and that's part of the problem. So like even me as a provider of managed security services to registered NERC entities and utilities, I am not a responsible entity. I don't have any NERC SIP requirements imposed on me directly. So none of the companies that you gave those examples, they're not, at least in how the rules are currently written, they wouldn't fall under NERC SIP, 13 or any of the other requirements. However, what we're seeing from the utilities is twofold. One, from a SIP 13 supply chain perspective, they do have some discretion on how they want to interpret that being applicable to their suppliers. They know that they have to have a supply chain risk management program because they are registered with NERC and have to comply with SIP 13. But the scope of suppliers they go and push that out to is kind of at their discretion. So we're seeing different utilities take different approaches, but the most common one we're seeing is utilities basically pushing out SIP 13 and then they're not playing the applicability game first and then shortening this and doing it. They're sending it to everyone. And then as they get further and further in the contracting process, they'll kind of get into some of the finer details. But for example, like for us to even respond to LADWP RFPs now, we've already had to go through their SIP 13 supply chain questionnaire and assessment process. Just respond to the RFP. Never mind to even get contracted for.
So a lot of people may get it, but it ends up not being relevant. But your point is be aware of where it's coming from and don't necessarily freak out.
Yeah, and the only change I would have to that is that it's being applied pretty much across the board, and it's not that it won't become relevant, but based on when they get into the nitty gritty and really define applicability, that's how much further they're going to go. The question about do you have security awareness and do you have cybersecurity insurance, you can bet you're getting those types of questionnaires regardless if you're in scope for their SIP 13 program. That is just general supply chain risk management questionnaires that companies of all shapes and sizes. And then the SIP 13 stuff is a little more specific, depending on what you're supplying to the utility.
Okay. All right. Well, if there are other questions from anybody else listening in here, I don't know whether I'm frightened or reassured by your talk, John. I'll have to think about that.
All right, fair enough.
But it's certainly something to be aware of. Anybody else want to join the conversation?
Hi, John. Yeah, I have a question for you. If your company is mostly a remote company, are there part of the security is people's access into the system? Are there special considerations when people are working primarily from homes?
I wouldn't necessarily even coin it as special anymore, since the whole world just went to a work from home model essentially last year, and that's become kind of the status quo. I will say that it has brought some lingering underlying security risks to the top. Mainly the bring your own device, so now offices used to have their corporate network, and maybe only a few more senior people had remote access into that network, depending on what their job was. They could VPN in if they needed to, but most people came into the office and working off a corporate issued device, laptop, or for accessing public resources that way. Well, now everyone's on a VPN or directly connecting to web-based business applications. And maybe they're doing it from, kids' school computer or, whatever it may be. So having some better security control in place and mitigate to corporate assets, definitely something that is much more challenging and important to do in the work from home remote model. But I would say
that. Could you restate that kind of from the beginning? You cut out for like a really important part.
Oh, sorry. In this work from home model where a lot of offices are going hybrid and remote, having ways to control and mitigate the risk of unmanaged devices, untrusted and potentially probably unsecure devices connecting into what hopefully is your secure corporate environment, right? And so, how do you mitigate that? And, through VPNs and checks on that machine and vulnerability scans and things like that. But I think, John, to your question, how does that change from a supplier perspective? I don't think so. It could raise some eyebrows depending on what scope of services or product you're supplying and how you're recommending that people connect in. Like if you need to connect in to devices that are deployed within the utilities network, for example, you're probably going to raise a few more eyebrows and get a few more questions when you tell them, oh, hey, we need to have this person coming from here and this person coming from there, versus saying, hey, would you whitelist my corporate network? And this is where all my employees are working. So that it's not wrong or bad, but you're probably going to get a few more questions.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering if practices like having a set virtual desktop that ran in the cloud with a known IP is more of a best practice now,
yes,
or not.
Yes, definitely. And it probably becomes a requirement depending on what you're providing to the utility to have dedicated jump server infrastructure.
Okay.
And again, the utility already has that requirement. If you're connecting into their environment, you're probably going through their jump server infrastructure.
Right.
And this is the tough part. Like, how far back are they going to reach into your corporate environment and what you're doing on your end? That's the question mark, because all of this is kind of unfolding as we speak. So again, you're going to get a different situation with one utility than you're going to get with the next utility.
Thank you.
All right. We're reaching, I guess, the limit of our talk here, but I also want to encourage people to think about, I guess, the unregulated side of security on this too, because if you have SMUD going into aggregations and having things that are bring your own devices, they're going to be very concerned about their image, and if you're play it loose and fast with consumer information, they will, probably not really like that. And I'd encourage people that are doing things to go and look at actually how, I guess, the medical industry protects their data by preventing things from being easily identifiable in databases. That's one way to make sure that you're not giving out too much, or basically monitor the information you collect and how you share it. And I wanted to let John take, I guess, the final comments on anything to wrap it up.
Yeah, I would just kind of reiterate what you said, Tom, is don't just think about this from a regulated utilities standpoint. Like I mentioned, phishing, email security is something that every single business, even if you're a one-person business, needs to think about in 2021. It's probably one of the greatest risks to your business if you didn't realize that already. So yeah, take this as a good step to do basic things for your own business, and then you'll be more prepared to do business with some of these more mature utilities in the future.
All right. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to launch a quick poll, and hopefully the people that are still here can just go in there and answer it. And as we do that, I'm going to wrap things up by thanking everyone for attending. A round of applause for John for presenting for us. Remind us that the next perspective is May 6th with Manetta VC. And then we're going to, on May 13th, have Paul Lau, the CEO of SMUD. And that one's not going to be at 9 a.m. So when I always say always at 9 a.m., well, this time it's not. And then remember Clean Tech and Community Energy on April 29th. We're going to have Block Power, SMUD, and Grid Alternatives talk about community energy projects that they're working on. And looks like we got all the polling done here. So we go ahead and end it. And wow, that's always fun. And additional thanks to our overall sponsors, Hacker Lab, Reverend, Greenberg, Traurig, and Momentum, our community of partners. Thank you, GridSME, for participating. And there's the results, if anyone's curious. And we're going to now wrap it up. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Great conversation. I'm reminded that in one of my companies, as careful as we were trying to be, what it came down to is a counterfeit chip. And regardless that it said Philips on it and it had all the right codes, we got in trouble because the chip was counterfeit.
Yep.
Because of the sensitivity of what